For and by you, the people.
Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Welcome to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, and I'm Brad Bannon. I'm a national Democratic strategist, a columnist for The Hill in Washington, D.C., and a political analyst for news radio stations KNX in Los Angeles and WGN in Chicago. My company, Bannon Communications Research, polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. BannonCR.com is the sponsor of today's show. If you'd like to find out more about me and my political polling company, or if you have any ideas or suggestions for Deadline DC, the best way to reach me is on Twitter. My handle is Brad Bannon, all one word. Today on Deadline DC, we have a great show for you. In the first segment, our guest will be Peter Montgomery from Right Wing Watch to talk about right-wing infiltration of the Capitol insurrection. Then in the second half hour, we'll bring together, just like Donald Trump brought together his cabinet this weekend, we'll bring together the provocative progressive political panel. Our guests on the panel today are, of course, our own executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, and the host of Terror Buster, Tara Devlin. First, before we go to our first guest, we're gonna play this clip from the testimony last week of Capitol Police Officer Daniel Hodges, who testified before the House committee investigating the abortive right-wing coup on the Capitol.
Officer Hodges, you characterized the attack on the Capitol as a white nationalist insurrection. Can you describe what you saw that led you to label the attack that way?
The crowd was overwhelmingly white males, usually a little bit older, middle-aged, older, but some younger. I think out of the entire time I was there, I saw just 2 women and 2 Asian males. Everyone else was white males. They didn't say anything especially xenophobic to me, but to my black colleagues and anyone who's not white. And some of them would try to recruit me. One of them came up to me and said, "Are you my brother?" There are many known organizations with ties to white supremacy had a presence there. I know, like 3%ers, Oath Keepers, that kind of thing. People who associate with Donald Trump are find more likely to subscribe to that kind of belief system.
That was Capitol Police Officer Daniel Hodges testifying before the House Investigatory Committee. Our guest in this half hour is Peter Montgomery, who is from Right Wing Watch. Today, Peter is going to join us to talk about what he saw in the testimony and, in general, the influence of right-wing insurrectionists in American society, which seems to be getting larger. Peter is a researcher for Right Wing Watch. He's spent a good part of his professional life tracking the activity of right-wing groups, which are a fundamental threat to American democracy. Pete's Twitter handle is Petemont, Petemont. And the website for Right Wing Watch is rightwingwatch.org. Peter, welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
First of all, why don't you comment on Officer Hodges' testimony?
Well, I thought his testimony, like the testimony of his other fellow officers, was hard to watch, and it was difficult, but it was just a lot of truth being spoken. And it was truth that the public needs to hear because it's being distorted and dismissed by Republican congressional leaders and right-wing media. So it was really important to have that truth spoken, that this was an insurrection. This was a violent attempt to overturn the results of the presidential election. People died, and there is a continuing threat to our democracy from the people who promoted this and carried it out.
You know, one of the things that I find truly amazing, well, perhaps horrifying is a better word, is how we're more than Joe Biden's been president for more than 6 months now. But you know, there are some people who believe that Donald Trump is going to be magically reinstated as president this month. Donald Trump had meeting with members of his old cabinet over the weekend at a golf course in New Jersey. And, you know, the implication was he's planning on, you know, continuing to be president. You know, of course, there was the right-wing coup attempt at the Capitol. There's still Trump loyalists are still counting ballots in Arizona, even though it's clear that Joe Biden won the state's electoral votes. You know, first of all, going back to Officer Hodges, what evidence is there about the influence of right-wing groups on the Capitol coup on January 6th?
Well, there's a lot of evidence going back to the months leading up to the coup attempt to the insurrection, when Right Wing Watch and a lot of other journalists and researchers were tracking the calls for violence and the plans for violence. And so that's why it was really unforgivable that we were not more prepared for this, because it should have been no surprise. And people like Stuart Rhodes, who's the head of the Oath Keepers, one of the militias that was very active at the Capitol, and he was there that day. You know, back in December, he said on the National Mall at a televised rally that if Trump didn't use his powers as commander-in-chief to stay in office, then militias like the Oath Keepers would have to wage a more bloody civil war. So they were planning for this. The evidence is that at the rally, there was a mix of all the different groups that pushed Trump's big lie. And your comments about the election, it's a reminder that the whole driving force behind this was Trump's decision to lie about the election, to claim that it was stolen from him rather than to admit that he lost. And then all these right-wing groups, right-wing media figures, Republican officials rallied around that lie, and that stirred anger and resentment among his supporters. And that is where this insurrection came from. And that's a mix of Trump loyalists, Christian nationalists, QAnon and other conspiracy theorists, far-right militia group types like the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Boogaloos, the Proud Boys, and, you know, some current and retired law enforcement and military. We did a report recently at Right Wing Watch that talks about the number of law enforcement officials who took part in the insurrection. So that's troubling. Anyway, so it's a mix of the whole right-wing coalition, all motivated and revved up by Donald Trump and his insistence that he won the election and that it was stolen from him. That's the big lie.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that big lie is really at the heart of this.
Yeah, it's really a very sad state of affairs. Our guest in this half hour is Peter Montgomery, who is a senior fellow at Right Wing Watch. He's here to talk about the role of right-wing nationalist groups in the abortive Capitol coup. And also, we're going to have a more general discussion about the influence of these right-wing extremists on American politics and society. But we're going to break now. If you're a radio listener, we'll be back in a couple of minutes. If you're watching us on Periscope TV or Facebook, or YouTube, will stay with us because we're not going anywhere. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon right after these messages. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back for your listening information and viewing information.
I want to get back to seeing my grandbabies every Sunday and smothering them with big hugs and kisses.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this segment is Peter Montgomery, who's a senior fellow for Right Wing Watch. And Peter's here to talk about the pernicious influence of right-wing extremist groups on American politics and society, especially their role in the abortive Capitol coup. Last week, the House of Representatives began its investigation into the Capitol riot, and we're going to find out, hopefully, more about the influence of these right-wing groups on the coup and American politics in general. Peter, why don't you tell us about some of the groups that had members participating in the riot in Capitol Hill? You mentioned one in our opening segment, the Oath Keepers. Who are the Oath Keepers exactly?
The Oath Keepers are a group that recruits from law enforcement and military and former law enforcement and military, and their name, Oath Keepers, says that they're allegedly just designed to encourage those people to uphold their oaths, to protect the rights of the American people, and to resist orders that would violate the Constitution. And taken outside of context, none of that sounds terribly threatening. But the context is really that Stuart Rhodes, the organizer of this, is a far-right activist. There is an ideology that is anti-federal government. That as I mentioned, he was so bought into Trump and trying to keep Trump in office that he has repeatedly, publicly threatened to wage bloody war if Trump was not kept in office. And during the insurrection, a number of his group's members were part of the assault on the Capitol, were inside the Capitol. A number of them have been charged. I don't believe he has been charged yet, even though there is video footage of him outside the Capitol after the insurrection with a group of his members standing around him. So that's certainly one group that has turned up on the radar screen of law enforcement. Another group is Proud Boys, which is a group that is kind of known more for street fighting. They have an ideology that they describe themselves as sort of Western chauvinists, and they like to show up where they think there might be left activists or anti-fascist activists that they want to fight with. It's a group that sort of celebrates violence in defense of the values that they champion. They were on the scene too. So it was quite an array of people, and you saw, of course, things like a noose hung up on a scaffold outside the Capitol, like they're ready to hang members of Congress or Vice President Pence if they got their hands on him.
Peter, we're going to go to a break now. This is Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this segment is Peter Montgomery from West Wing Watch. We'll be back with our viewers and our listeners right after this, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. My guest in this half hour is Peter Montgomery, Senior Fellow at Right Wing Watch. And we've been discussing the participation of right-wing nationalist groups on the Capitol riot, the abortive Capitol coup. You know, it bothers me even to say we had an attempted coup in the United States, but we did. Basically, these right-wing extremists, along with other crazies, tried to block the election of Joe Biden, who was overwhelmingly elected as president of the United States. Biden won by something like 8 million votes. He had a decisive victory in the Electoral College, but despite that, these groups on January 6th tried to prevent the certification of Joe Biden's election, and they're still trying to harbor this fantasy of Donald Trump coming back. Let me ask you about that, Pete. I don't remember the exact date. I guess maybe August 13th or August 14th. There are people out there among these groups who honestly think that somehow Donald Trump is going to be magically reinstated as president this month. Do they really believe that? Or are they just using this as his fantasy as a way of ginning up their fundraising and activating their members? What do you think's going on here? This is kind of crazy.
Well, it's always hard to know, but you're right. And there's actually been sort of a moving date. Initially, some of them predicted that Trump would be back in March, and then it was April. Then Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy, who's been funding a lot of this Stop the Steal work, has predicted that Trump would be back in office in August. There's a lot of people from the prophets and apostles wing of the Christian right that have been also prophesying that Trump would be back in office. They had first prophesied that he was going to win the election, and some of them aren't willing to admit that they were wrong on that front. So the other thing to remember about this is that not only are they sort of raising hopes and keeping the Trump base revved up with claims like this, they're also using this to justify all these anti-voting rights laws and voter suppression laws that are happening around the country. They're using the claims of the stolen election, the claims that somehow 2020 was fraudulent, was illegitimate, to justify changing the law. So these Republican legislators hope Democrats won't win it again. And that's another really nefarious thing that's going on, a really dangerous thing that's going on, also grounded in this lie of the stolen election. And people who can find online, Jane Mayer at The New Yorker, who's a tremendous journalist, she just put out a piece today on the sort of involvement of some of the right wing's big funders and sort of big infrastructure supporters on this whole Stop the Steal so-called election integrity movement. Groups like the Bradley Foundation and all the people there now funding to keep up this right-wing narrative about voter fraud and election integrity, which is supporting Trump's claims and supporting right-wing efforts to make it harder for some people to vote.
Let me ask you another question. There have been questions raised about the relationship of members of these extremist groups to certain Republican members of Congress. Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia comes to mind, Paul Gosar from Arizona, Lauren Brobart from Colorado. What exactly are the relationships between these groups and these particular members of Congress?
Well, some of those folks are hard right. Marjorie Taylor Greene sort of came out of the QAnon conspiracy theory, Trump supporting right. Paul Gosar from Arizona has openly aligned himself with Nick Fuentes, a promoter of his white nationalist America First group, Gosar actually spoke at his convention, which was, overtly white nationalist and Christian nationalist. And so it's really troubling that we have a sitting member of Congress doing that. Another member is Mo Brooks of Alabama, who was speaking at the Ellipse on that day, part of revving up the crowd and sending them off, sicking them on the Capitol. And it just came out in the last couple of days that Brooks knew that there was going to be some trouble. And so that he was actually wearing body armor under his windbreaker while he was down on the mall that day. So one of the important things that the select committee has to look at is the role of members of Congress. I mean, we know that Donald Trump played a huge responsibility for stirring this up, and that right-wing media did, but there's a lot to learn about members of Congress who were on the phone with Donald Trump during the insurrection, members of Congress who may have helped the insurrectionists by giving them tours the day before, helping them make their plans. So there's a lot of real getting to the bottom of members of Congress who are associated with extremist groups and who are promoting, a really dangerous agenda to undermine our democracy.
Well, let me ask you about one thing, and I've seen countless references about this on social media, which doesn't necessarily make it true. Again, Paul Gosar from Arizona? At least a few of them gave tours to groups of the Capitol in the days before the uprising. Now, of course, members of Congress give tours to their constituents all the time. Do you think they were actually doing reconnaissance tours for the attack on the Capitol, or do we have any evidence to back that up, or is that just sheer speculation?
I think we need to learn the answer to that question. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but I think, this is not a normal time at the Capitol. We're closed down for COVID. I don't think it was a normal thing for a member of Congress to be leading around people who were in town the day before this happened. So I'm very suspicious that members of Congress were yes, helping people do recon, and I think we need to figure that out. That's one of the many reasons we needed a commission like this, because the Republican congressional leadership is desperate to move on, to downplay this, to pretend that it wasn't something serious.
Yeah, they seem to be doing everything they can to diminish the impact of the hearings, including refusing to seat any GOP members on the panel. The speaker had to do that for them.
And it's hard for me to be surprised by these guys at this point, but I've also found it stunning that we had members of Congress and members of the right-wing media just mocking and belittling these police officers, some of whom nearly gave their lives that day and who said that they feared that they were going to lose their lives that day battling with these crowds, for more than an hour.
Peter, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks for joining us today on Deadline DC. I'm sure at some point we'll have you back to talk about the pernicious influence of these right-wing groups on American society. We'll be back after these messages.
Hey, Dad, how do airplanes fly? What's in this box? Can I touch this? Where does sand come from? Is this tree good for climbing? What happens if I mix these two things together? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them safe. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.
Right now, our country feels divided, but there's a place where people are coming together. I gotta tell you, I was nervous to talk to someone so different than me.
Me too, but I'm glad we are.
Love Has No Labels and One Small Step are helping people with different political views, beliefs, and life experiences come together through conversation, and it feels good.
Wow, your story is so...
Interesting?
Yeah.
When people actually sit down, talk, and listen to one another, they can break down boundaries and connect as human beings. At lovehasnolabels.com/onesmallstep, you can listen to amazing, life-changing conversations and find simple tools to start a conversation of your own.
I know one thing. This conversation gives me hope.
It gives me a lot of hope, too.
Take a step toward bringing our country and your community together by having the courage to start a conversation at lovehasnolabels.com/onesmallstep. A message from StoryCorps, Love Has No Labels, and the Ad Council.
When I was just a tyke, cowboy actors were marketed as role models for little backyard cowpokes like me. And we could send off to get a certificate, making us pals of the saddle or some such with Roy Rogers, Hopalong Cassidy, or others. Cute for a 4-year-old, less so for 57-year-old Jeff Spaceboy Bezos. Yet, the gabillionaire profiteer, labor exploiter, and tax scofflaw who heads the Amazon online retail syndicate was all dressed up in July, play-acting as a heroic conqueror of space. Little Jeff took an ego trip on his very own rocket ship, publicizing it as some combination of Wright brothers innovation and Apollo moon landing. But the whole thing took only 11 minutes, barely made it to space, achieved no scientific purpose, and did zero to enhance American prestige in the world. As for personal genius or heroics, Bezos didn't invent or build the spacecraft, didn't have any role in flying it, and he faced no cosmic unknowns. He didn't even have to wear a spacesuit. All he really did was to buy the spacecraft. But he did get to dress up in a sort of space-style jogging outfit with his name and his corporate logo emblazoned on it. Then, like a little boy getting a cereal box certificate proclaiming him a cowboy, when the diminutive mega-billionaire floated back to terra firma, he held a fake ceremony at which some former NASA official pinned a set of phony astronaut wings on him. More pathetically, his corporate lobbyists are said to be appealing to Washington officials to award official astronaut wings for what amounted to a rich man's carnival ride. This is Jim Hightower saying, so there you have the new pantheon of America's flight heroes, the Wright brothers, Amelia Earhart, John Glenn, and Jeff Spaceboy Bezos. Did I mention pathetic?
Welcome back. Deadline. Half hour, as is our custom, we are going to go with the provocative progressive political panel. You can see the panelists there on the screen for those of you on Periscope TV. But before we get to the panel, we're going to run 2 clips from Sunday morning talk shows, one from representing the position of Senator Joe Manchin, and the other one representing a comment on infrastructure from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Can you guarantee to AOC that a reconciliation package will pass the Senate? Because her concern is that this infrastructure bill might be bipartisan, but it's scaled back so much, it's not as bold as it should be and what the country needs. Can you guarantee her that the reconciliation package will pass?
I can't really guarantee anybody, you know, and I have not guaranteed anybody on any of these pieces of legislation. We would like to do more. Yeah, you can do what you can pay for. This is paid for. Our infrastructure bill is all paid for. We don't have a debt that we're going to incur more debt and throwing onto it. And on the other, as far as the reconciliation bill, should be looked at the same. That's why I said we're going to get the budget resolution. Let's start the process and then see where it goes. On that, we should just work in good faith and be honest with each other so no one's misled any way, shape, or form. And there should be no quid pro quo. You do this, I'll do this. When it comes to big legislation, does it help the American people? How do you tell over 80% of the people, Democrats and Republicans, that we can't do an infrastructure bill, a traditional infrastructure? There's a lot of need out there for the human infrastructure, I understand. But some of these programs that they're going to be putting in place could be in perpetuity. And even though it only has a 10-year run on it, so it's been scored at 10 years at 3.5, it might have perpetuity, it would be 5 trillion or more. So we have to look at everything and be honest with ourselves.
And will you vote for it?
We have to hold on to that bargain. If there is not a reconciliation bill in the House, and if the Senate does not pass the reconciliation bill, we will uphold our end of the bargain and not pass the bipartisan bill until we get all of these investments in. And I want to be clear that the investments in the bipartisan bill are not all, candy land. There are some of these quote unquote pay-fors that are very alarming that we need to see the language on. For example, some of the language around privatizing public infrastructure, putting toll roads, leasing public infrastructure to private entities are very concerning and should be concerning to every American. So we really need to see that language and see what's put in there until it reaches, when it reaches the House. Bipartisan doesn't always mean that it's in the interest of the public good, frankly. Sometimes there's a lot of corporate lobbyist giveaways in some of these bills.
Okay, you just heard Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York with their dueling visions of infrastructure. This half hour of Deadline DC is brought to you by Bannon Communications Research, my firm which polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. The western United States is enveloped in a massive heat wave and by devastating forest fires. Nearly 100 people died in a collapsed condo in Miami, Florida. The power grid went down in Texas during an unseasonable winter freeze and a summer heat wave. We need to build America back and build American back greener. The bipartisan infrastructure package in the Senate is nice, but it's not nearly enough to meet the urgent need to rebuild the United States, to fight the worldwide ravages of climate change. You can read all my columns in The Hill at muckrack.com/Brad-Bannon. Now it's time for the provocative progressive political panel. Joining us on the panel today is Tara Devlin, the host of Terror Buster, her unapologetically liberal podcast, which I hope you all sample. And we also have on the panel today our own executive producer and progressive activist, Mark Grimaldi. Mark has worked on several Democratic presidential campaigns. He's also has a fervent interest in campaign finance reform and funding cancer research. Welcome to Deadline DC, panel. Let's start off with you, Tara. The Senate last week agreed to have a vote on an infrastructure package, which some call the skinny infrastructure package, which comes to about $1.2 trillion. Now, in the bipartisan package, you have basic nuts and bolts infrastructure. You have money for replacing lead water pipes. You have money for improving the reach of the World Wide Web. You have money for electric buses. But there's really nothing in there that systematically addresses the urgent needs that this nation is facing. Now, we are in a tricky situation here. It looks to me that after the Senate vote last week, the Senate bipartisan infrastructure package probably has the votes to pass. But if it does pass, it still has to go to the House, and several prominent progressives, including Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who we'd heard from the clip, had said they will vote against it. And Speaker Pelosi has also said that she may not even have a vote on the bipartisan package, Senate package, until there's a vote in the House on the broader infrastructure package, which amounts to just over $3 trillion that is supported by Ocasio-Cortez and progressives in both the House and the Senate. So, Tara, why don't you begin? Why do we need the broader infrastructure package that is supported by progressives in the House and the Senate? And do you think we'll ever get it, actually?
If we don't, I mean, eventually the effects of climate change will be too much to ignore, and unfortunately, I don't know
let me stop you there. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you
Right.
can't ignore them right
We
now.
can't ignore it now. Exactly.
I mean,
So
last week there were massive storms that led to flooding in Western Europe
Right.
and
Exactly.
China. To say
Yeah.
nothing of what's happening in the United States, we
Right.
have massive forest fires all over the West that are caused by extreme heat and drought. I don't know what more we need exactly.
Exactly. Well, I think we need to sweep the floors of the forests or something. I think that's what the Republicans wanted, right? That was Trump's advice. Just keep sweeping the floors of the forest. Well, besides the point, the fact is that we're we're in big trouble as it is, like you're saying. And I don't know what it is about human beings that we can't that we won't delay the inevitable. For some reason, we just put it off and put it off and put it off. But I think obviously it's due to greed, and the system is broken. That's why we're in this boat. If it wasn't broken, we wouldn't have gotten this far into where the world is on the verge of what is it? I can't say that word. Of being uninhabitable. And so right now, in order to appease the Republicans, they took out from this bipartisan bill many of the climate change provisions in there, as if we have time to waste. But that's all they care about. In fact, the Republican bill on the infrastructure deals with primarily the old-fashioned view of infrastructure, highways, roads. They don't want to do anything for public transportation either, because it's as if, just like they're on the side of the virus, it seems, they're also on the side of turning this planet into an uninhabitable, I don't know, just turning it uninhabitable. Why would you focus on highways, meaning you want people to continue to drive, but you don't want to do anything to ensure that the American people have options to be, as the Chinese are flying around on bullet trains, we're still with the same old infrastructure from Eisenhower. We're worried about the interstate highways, which is really not a leading country.
Okay, Tara, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to break. When we return with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, we'll have more of our provocative progressive political panel with Tara Devlin and Mark Grimaldi.
All right.
What I know about courage, I learned from my adoptive mom. She said sometimes...
Welcome back.
All right.
To Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. In this half hour, as we usually do, we have the provocative progressive political panel. Our guest on the panel today are Tara Devlin, who is the host of Tara Buster, who has her own coffee mug for the show.
That's right.
I'm very proud of to own.
That's right.
And we also have our executive producer and liberal activist, Mark Grimaldi. Mark, let me get to you. It seems to me that in terms of infrastructure, we have an array of possibilities. We could have end up with no infrastructure package at all, or we could end up with two infrastructure packages. Now, essentially, this is very tricky. It looks to me that on the basis of last week's cloture vote, there is enough Senate support to pass the bipartisan bill, which is, as Tara just said before we went to break, very nuts and bolts, highways, some internet, some electric buses, but it's basically a nuts and bolts, roads and bridges package. Now, the problem is, even though it probably have the votes to pass the Senate, it may not have the votes to pass the House because several progressives in the House and the Speaker have said there's not going to be a vote on the Senate package until there is a vote in the Senate on the broader Biden-supported package, which is about cost about 3 times as much. Has nuts and bolts infrastructure in it, but also has provisions to fight climate change, and also includes Medicare expansion for dental and eye care. So it's a much broader package. Now, the problem with that package is it can only be passed through reconciliation, which requires 50 votes in the Senate. And there are 2 Democrats, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Karen Sinema of Arizona, who said that the $3 trillion is too rich for the blood. So we could have 2 different infrastructure packages or no infrastructure packages at all, or maybe just one of them. Mark, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think it remains to be seen as to how the House is going to react, because it appears that the Senate is going to push ahead with this bipartisan package. And honestly, I think that the House should stand strong against this, because the needs of the country are much broader than this package. And there's an opportunity through reconciliation to get a much broader package passed. I do think that Manchin and Sinema are, holding it up right now, basically, from having that dual track. But I also think that there should be some wiggle room. And I think it's smart, honestly, by the House progressives to not just, cash in their hand, because then what leverage do they have? If they just vote yes on the bipartisan package, then their leverage is frankly gone on these massively important issues that affect the planet. I'll wrap up there because I know we're coming back.
Welcome. We'll be back with Deadline DC right after these messages.
Healthcare reform around the country. Until next time, stay healthy.
Welcome back to Deadline DC. Brad Bannon. We have with us the provocative progressive political panel. Joining us on the panel today are Tara Devlin, who is the host of the unapologetically liberal Tara Buster show, and we have liberal activist Mark Grimaldi. Tara, let me ask you this. Spending as much time as I do on social media, probably too much time. Maybe I should go back and read books instead or something. I don't know. But anyway, I do spend an unfortunate amount of time on social media, both for this show and to write my Hill column every week to see what's going on. And, it struck me there's a bewildering set of progressive priorities out there. We have, of course, climate change. Which we've already talked about in the segment. We have a need for Medicare for all. Mark is an activist on campaign funding reform, which is also fundamental. We have this struggle going on in Congress now and in the state legislatures on voting rights, especially for people of color. And, it struck me, and I'm not sure about this, but, look at them all. what are the priorities here?
Okay.
You know, all these are important issues. I would argue that all these are important issues. But Tara, what do you think is the single biggest priority about the
Right.
issues that we've
Well,
discussed?
you're 100% correct. This is what drives me insane. It's the cognitive dissonance of messaging that we're getting from the Democrats, and that's a response to the fact that the Democrats aren't unified in themselves. Manchin and Sinema, an example of that. Although I think their Sinema especially is more all about sucking up the attention in whatever way possible. But that's beside the point. It's what I think is the most pressing issue right now is to stop the voter suppression tactics and to stop the Republican Party from destroying American democracy. Other than that, what's the whatever infrastructure? Sure. I mean, Infrastructure Week has been a laugh line for the past 5 years and more. That could be put on the shelf. I find it a little bit confusing. So we have Joe Biden and the Democrats in leadership saying that we're up against an existential crisis of against democracy from these right wingers, and that is the truth. We're in the middle of a coup. They're still at it, and
yeah, they are.
Yes, and then on the other hand, we're trying to get bipartisan support for an infrastructure package from the same traitors who are in the midst of a coup right now. So, well, which is it? I think that the Democrats need to use their bully pulpit to maintain a consistent message. Either the Republicans are a threat to democracy, or they're your partners. Which one is it? You can't have it both ways, in my opinion. So why are we trying to get bipartisan support from traitors? I mean, what else are they? I'm not being hyperbolic. They are trying to install a con man who received fewer votes, and it's still going on. They're not in any way sorry. There's no reconciliation possible with people who don't take any responsibility, and they're still at it. So I mean, I'm at a loss here. It drives me crazy to think that the Democrats, because of what it is that the Democrats are giving the Republicans they're kind of rehabbing their image by pretending that they're partners in this. Meanwhile, they are actively trying to overthrow democracy. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know. Maybe you have some insight. I think that's the number one priority, money in politics. But yes.
Mark, you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I agree with Tara wholeheartedly. The answer out of my mouth was going to be voting rights, and the reason is because that unlocks all of these other issues.
That's right.
It's an umbrella over everything else. However you want to look at it, whatever analogy you want to use, if you lose many people lose the power to vote, then the interests of the American people are going to be even more represented by just a few in power. Mm-hmm. And it's going to become even more disproportionately difficult for minorities and people of low income to vote, to exercise their right to vote. So that would be my number one issue. I do think that there should be the filibuster should be eliminated, but if for some reason they're not going to, which it does not look like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, as per usual, are going to allow that to happen, then I think there needs to be a carve-out for the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because otherwise there's no way you're going to control all these Republican state legislatures that are passing all of these voter suppression bills throughout the country under the guise of the big lie by Donald Trump, saying, oh, we need these bills because there was voter fraud, even though they can't point to any statistically significant amount of voter fraud. That's why that would be number one. Right. No, exactly. And that's why that would be number one on my list. I also think Tara highlights just a very odd reality that's going on right now at the Capitol. I mean, the Capitol is actually still basically on lockdown and security from the failed coup that was egged on by many members of Congress. And within that secured area, they're negotiating with them.
Right.
I do think that one of the reasons that the bipartisan bill means so much to the Biden administration, to be completely honest with you, is it's got a lot of public support, and it would be a legislative win for the president to be able to say, look, I can, work with the other side of the country, or excuse me, of, the political spectrum. I think that's why it's a focus. However, I think President Biden has acted bold, in moments when we did not necessarily expect him to coming in office. And that's why he has proposed, these bold actions like the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure package. So I hope that he sticks to his guns, because frankly, those proposals are needed right now. They're sorely needed, because not only did we, not progress anywhere on issues like climate and healthcare during the Trump administration, we lost a lot of ground. So it's going to take large action, big, bold action to not only make up ground, but try to get ahead now.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, it's sort of like, picking among, which of your children do you love the most. Yeah. I should also say that part of the big infrastructure package, the $3 trillion package, which Senator Bernie Sanders discussed last week, was expanding Medicare to include people 60 or over. So essentially, you wouldn't have to wait until you're 65. It would also include broadening Medicare to cover dental and vision care. So I think that's a compelling reason for one of the compelling reasons for the package. One thing I saw last week, the United Nations released some kind of study that said that by the end of this century, climate change could kill 83 million people. And I don't, honestly, I asked you a question about which of these is the biggest priority. I don't know how to, answer it myself, to be honest with you. I always thought for a long time that the secret to changing this country was campaign finance reform. As long as there's big money in politics, nothing's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But you read these things about the devastation of climate change, denying people the right to vote. And sometimes I feel we're moving backwards instead of forwards. And there are good reasons for, doing all these things. Anyway, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank all our guests. Peter Montgomery from Right Wing Watch, who joined us in the first half hour. And today on the panel, the host of Terror Buster, Tara Devlin, and also the giver of this great cup, which I love.
Yes.
And our own producer, Mark Grimaldi. Leslie Marshall will be back tomorrow. Be safe and be strong in these troubled times, and watch Deadline DC every Monday at 3 p.m. live Eastern Time, or the podcast anytime. Thank you. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right.